Welcome to the Growler, a Who Dat podcast, hosted by Paul Dana and other bald friends like Mo Egger, Dave Nanametz, home of all your Bengals breaks, takes. Welcome to the Growler.
All right, welcome into the latest edition of the Growler. Balds don't lie. I have brought in another bald, which is great. No, I'm missing Mo and Dave are not here, but we've dipped in. We're staying in Cincinnati. We're staying in the Cincinnati waters for today's episode, and that means going right across town to Pro Football Focus. Our good friend Steve Palazzolo, Sam Monson. Sam, how's you're looking good? A nice tight shave, looking really good over there.
Yeah, we got a couple of days worth of growth on this, and then I haven't hit the cadence yet. The problem is with going bald is you got to go back to that. That's why I have a beard, right? Because I was too lazy to shave every day. But now you got to go back to this. I haven't settled into the routine of how often I've got to do it.
Embrace, and just go after it. It doesn't have to be every day, but the hard part is when you start noticing and you're like, you're right. I'm one day too late. I got to go get there. And you're working the edges, but you got to be critical of yourself. You got to be critical of yourself.
I'm noticing the bias you have here in your guests, Paul, that you latched on to Sam immediately. First time in his life.
Bald brethren. It's what we do. We've got to stick together out there. It's tough. It's tough in the world. Well, thanks guys for joining. I want to, you guys do an incredible job, of course, over on the PFF NFL podcast. It is an elite tier among national pod listens. I'll put you guys up in the elite. It's a regular top of the list for me. Whenever anything's going on, really, you guys have been cranking through a lot of good stuff lately, whether we're talking about over-unders or position rankings and things like that. Great. I ask everyone to go give that a listen, but I think I've found the Bengals conversations very interesting because you two have been divided in some ways amongst way you look at them. And so I kind of want to start there a little bit in that. What is your, where is the divide, Sam? I'll start with you. Where is the divide with you guys in viewing the Bengals in the landscape of the NFL and the AFC right now in terms of real contenders, if they'll be able to live up to expectations and how you see it?
Well, I think it will shock nobody that listens to our podcast to learn that Steve is on the more optimistic side of the spectrum than I am when it comes to the Bengals. That's usually the way we break down whenever there is a divide. It's funny because the offseason is about selling hope for every team, right? There's always a way of spinning whatever move your team makes in an optimistic, positive outlook. And that's the way everybody wants to do it because you just got through the season where 31 of the 32 teams didn't get the result that they wanted. And so the offseason is all about, well, how can we get there next year? And let's figure out a way that we can be better. But every now and again, you get a team where despite theoretically adding players in free agency, adding players in the draft and, ratcheting up all the hope, you get a team where it doesn't feel like the overall net result of all that is tremendously positive. And, a couple of years ago, Dallas was in this situation where the feel for the offseason just didn't feel great. At minimum, you were sort of painting this optimistic outlook was getting you to where they were already, not necessarily taking a step forward, but just treading water with whatever that level they were at before. I feel a little bit like that for the Bengals this year. I think they had a lot of departures. They've done a reasonable job of patching those back together and, replacing the players that they've lost. But anytime that you do that, you're always running the risk that those moves just don't work. And, in particular, the Bengals, the Eagles have been good at this recently where they've identified sort of potential losses a couple of years in advance and strategized and identified guys to come in and, created a succession plan. But we've already seen the succession plan hasn't worked every time they've tried it. Guys like Dax Hill in the secondary hasn't been the player that they expected him to be so far. And every time one of those moves doesn't work, the good work of preparing for it essentially goes straight out the window.
So I've chosen the optimistic path, and I think because they're still the Bengals and Joe Burrow is still Joe Burrow, and I think we've forgotten just how good he is. And I don't think Jake Browning going on a nice little run down the stretch last year should diminish the fact that when Joe Burrow is the quarterback here, it's a completely different team. They are capable of beating the Chiefs and beating the Bills, and they do win those big games more often than not over the last couple of years. So that's what I've leaned into. I think the point that Sam makes, though, is fair when you look at if Dax Hill was a hit, or if maybe last year's draft class, Miles Murphy in the first round, if he showed a little bit more, or if DJ Turner showed a little bit more, those spots on the depth chart, the depth on the defensive line, feeling better about Turner as a starting corner, you'd feel better about that defense. But I'm viewing this through the lens of I love what they've done with the offensive line, again, to put the right pieces in place. Trent Brown coming in, Amarius Mims in the draft. I like what they did at safety to kind of deal with some of the issues. Clearly, the defense didn't have the same communication and flexibility last year, so bringing Von Bell back and bringing a Geno Stone in. So I think they did get back to where they were in 21 and 22, which is a Super Bowl contender. That's why I'm more optimistic, even though I don't know if they're better than they were then. But Joe Burrow, those playmakers, a good enough offensive line, and a more flexible defense, to me, that's the team that can challenge the Chiefs, the Bills, and those top teams in the AFC.
Yeah, so much of this does come back to the defensive side of the ball, because then you look at their offense and, look, Burrow will make it sing, and you got Chase and Higgins, and that's good, right? It's going to be fine. I think is the view. But defensively, how much do you feel like you see across the league the ability to see a lot of what Lou Anarumo did here in 21 and 22 of taking a group that wasn't necessarily individually spectacular and make them work to be greater than the sum of their parts? Is that something that you feel like is sustainable, or do you feel like when you look across the league, that is maybe a little bit of an overrated element? Not that defensive coordinators can be overrated, but the idea of doing that every year is just easier said than done.
I almost feel like that strategy has an expiry date. You can get things going by smoke and mirrors for a while, but I think you almost reach a point in the season where you run out of smoke and mirrors, and ultimately the talent has to show at some point. And once the tape reaches a certain volume and teams have a better idea of what you're doing, they can diagnose it, they can shut it down. I think Brian Flores with the Minnesota Vikings had a really good example of that last year, where the Vikings did not have much talent on defense whatsoever. And Flores was working absolute wonders with that group for 2/3 of the season. And then he ran out of magic, and teams had just figured it out and they understood how to attack it better. And at that point, you need the talent to get better, to step up, to make the difference. And they weren't able to do that. And the Vikings defense kind of got exposed late in the season. That's, the concern for the Bengals for me is, you look at a couple of areas on that defense and you sort of say, that's not a great collection of talent right now. Corner is the obvious one, right? Like you look at their corner room now, Mike Hilton is a really good guy in the slot, but outside in particular, you look at that and you say, okay, they might be able to hide those guys for a while and you can get the high end of play for half a season, but particularly in the playoffs. And look, this is always contextualized by, even in the worst case scenario, the Bengals with Joe Burrow and the talent that they have, they're going to be good. They're going to be a playoff caliber team. It's the grading on a curve thing. Like, this team wants to win a Super Bowl. They've been to a Super Bowl. That's now the bar for Cincinnati, for Buffalo, for Kansas City, for all these real contenders. And that's when you have to start looking at, guys like DJ Turner and saying, okay, if he doesn't take a step forward, which is perfectly possible for any of these young guys, but if that doesn't happen, how are they going to offset that with scheme, with everything else that they're doing? And that's tough to do for an entire season and a playoff run.
Yeah, I think to answer the question about defense generally, I mean, counting on the defense is just harder to do in the NFL. We've seen this historically. Teams that are great defenses one year end up middle of the pack and vice versa. So a team like the Jets that's had 2 straight years of elite defense, and now Aaron Rodgers is back. And on paper, it's like, well, the Jets are a Super Bowl contender. You could easily see their defense regress this year, in part because of who you play. It's just difficult to do. I think the advantage that Lou Anarumo's defense has, though, is the flexibility. And I think they lost some of that last year. They were a very game plan-oriented defense. They're not, to Sam's point about Flores, he kind of had a system that he ran early on last year that eventually ran out of steam. I don't know if Lou has a definitive system so much as they make great second half adjustments. And they have, I keep going back to second half of the AFC Championship a few years ago, rushing 3 against Mahomes. That's not a system so much as it is a game plan adjustment and decision that is made, that's where I think Lou hangs his hat. So I think he still has the ability to make the defense better than the sum of their parts as a whole, because he's not leaning into just one specific way of doing things.
Where do you see Cam Taylor-Britt falling short right now, Sam? Because Cam, I thought watching him last year, you saw the leap, and right before he got hurt, unfortunately for him and Burrow, Cam is sort of the under-discussed injury of last year that really set things sideways for them on a defense that was already struggling. But right around that week 4 or 5, you saw Cam Taylor-Britt take a leap, and he had a bunch of picks. He was making plays. He appeared to have sort of taken that step. Where do you see him not being a guy that you could count on yet? Or is that just a simple look? You can't say that the arrows made it there until it actually makes it there with him.
Yeah, I think it's just a sample size thing, really. I think you're right. Like he was on the back of a really nice run when he got hurt, and had that, if that's the arrow and if that's where he's headed and the projection had kept going, I think you would definitely come into the season feeling really good about him and saying, all right, one guy, really high level player, ascending player, and we're good. And it's the other spot we need to be concerned about. But I think just the length of time, we've been doing this, you just understand the volatility of that position as much as anything else. And that run doesn't necessarily mean, number one, that it would continue. Even if it did, it doesn't mean it would continue into the next year. And you might just get the sort of drop off from him. I think, you can be entirely reasonable to feel good about Cam Taylor-Britt as one of your 2 starters, but it's also entirely possible that you don't get that level of play from him again this year. And that, coupled with the other side, would be where the problem is. It's like now we've got 2 outside corners that are not playing at that kind of level. And that's a disaster in today's NFL.
I mean, he's been an impressive player overall, though. I think athletic, plays zone very well, the way the Bengals like to play. I've liked the development of Cam Taylor-Britt, so I definitely feel better about him going into year 3 for him than I do DJ Turner going into year 2.
You mentioned volatility. I'm kind of curious. What do you guys view as the most volatile position in the league right now, where from year to year you just don't know what the hell you can count on?
I think it is corner. I mean, just by and it's intuitive, right? It's by the nature of that position. It's so reactive. You are at the mercy, effectively, of the offensive players that you're playing. And that classic adage of like the perfect throw and the perfect pass beats the perfect coverage every time. That's the reality of corner play, where even if you are fundamentally playing at the same level, your results, which effectively are how you're going to get judged, can be wildly different year to year. And you're not going to be playing at the same level every single year. And the mistakes that you make are just going to be magnified. So you can get these completely different outcomes year to year for all these corners, even for guys that you think are, he's the best in the NFL. It might not look like it next year.
Yeah, it's basically anything coverage related. And so if you're using the baseline of production, whether you're using a PFF grade or you're using completion percentage, yards per attempt, or yards per target, touchdowns allowed, anything coverage related is really volatile because of just the nature of football. And it could be because of the matchups that you have. It could be you have to face Mahomes, Allen, Lamar, 6 times a year or whatever it might be. So it's just the nature of football. I think that anything coverage related tends to be a little bit more volatile if you're using production as a baseline.
Well, let's talk about what you have to talk about with the Bengals, and that is the offensive line, because it's contractually obligated for everybody that discusses the team, especially in this city, who no city cares more about offensive line play. Where would you rank them currently across the league? They have made improvements where every year on paper you could say it looks better than it did the previous, since the disaster of the 70 sacks and making it to the Super Bowl. But where are they now? Do you see them? Are they top 10? Are they sneaking in there? Are they middle of the pack still? Are they still are still a worry and a concern? Where do you see it, Steve?
I think they're in the middle of the pack. Without every offensive line off the top of my head, I would say they're probably somewhere between like 14 and 18, right? They're somewhere dead smack in the middle. And we use the phrase creep back toward average all the time on our show. And this just looks like the epitome of an average, and I use that as an endearing term, average offensive line, right? That is a whole bunch of solid NFL starting caliber players. So that means if you get the if you get the baseline play from Orlando Brown Jr., Cordell Volson, Ted Karras, Alex Kappa, Trent Brown, Amarius Mims as a swing guy, if you get the baseline play, you can run an offense, right? Joe Burrow will have enough time to create plays down the field. He'll be under pressure sometimes. They'll run the ball well enough. If you get the high end, we've seen Orlando Brown Jr. play better than he did in Cincinnati. We've seen Trent Brown play some really good football. We've seen Alex Kappa play really good football. Ted Karras. If you get the high end of those guys, it might be O-line 8. It might be O-line 6. If you get the bottom end of those guys, though, the worst of Orlando Brown, which was more of last year, the worst of Trent Brown, the worst of those guys, then it's like O-line 25, right? So, I mean, that's just the nature of that position as well. But on paper, I think they have all the pieces they need. They stay healthy and they play to their baseline production, all the pieces they need to maybe have the best line that they've had in the Joe Burrow era.
Yeah, we've been preaching this for years, right? You don't need an elite offensive line. Sure, you'd love one, but they tend to cost a lot, right? Either with free agent salaries or with in really high draft picks. You just need an average line. You need one that isn't going to be the reason that your offense can't function. And I think a few teams in recent years, and actually some pretty good ones, have understood that and kind of prioritized, okay, we need this, the line needs to be improved, but it doesn't necessarily need to be with crazy top of the market deals. Buffalo seemed to prioritize it this way, and Cincinnati seemed to prioritize it this way. And I think the Bengals really might be the poster child right now for that creep back toward average mantra. And I think they've done it. This is an average offensive line. And as Steve said, that's not a bad thing, right? That's where you want your offensive line to be, because it's also an average investment in the offensive line, which means the resources can go to other places like the Joe Burrow contract and Jamar Chase contract. And like, those are the deals that let you make those kinds of contracts happen.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys had a copyright on No Donkeys a few years ago, but I stole it and used it over the top a lot because it was for 2 straight off seasons. The Bengals approach was find me someone solid who's not a liability and pay him $6 million, right? Or $7 or $8 million, or whatever the 12th or 20th highest paid at their position is. And that's how they got Orlando Brown at the deal, Ted Karras, Kappa. All of these guys really were that. In the combination now of Mims and Browner is another example of that. It's the No Donkeys approach, and they've sort of lived by it. So I apologize if I stole that from you, because I know I heard it from you guys first, but I did use it a lot. I should make a confessional here of this today.
No, that's great. You should continue to use all that. So look, adding Amarius Mims too is the future proofing of that position, right? Assuming that he's good enough, you have a cheap offensive tackle now for 4 or 5 years. And that helps set up the future of paying Jamar Chase and paying T. Higgins if you choose to do so, and paying Trey Hendrickson. So those are crucial positions right now to keep the offensive line relatively cheap, but also good. So overall, I do like what they've done.
One question I'll ask you guys. You guys are the perfect people to ask this. I know this is kind of hard to do off the top of your head. But in general, how many players do you think the Bengals have in the top 10 of their position? It's something that I have used to gauge roster around here for a while, since they were not super at it. And I'd always say, people, name me a player that's in the top 10 at their position. And you could you name a few? For a while, you couldn't hardly name any. They have some now. I'm curious, maybe if there's guys that you view, obviously Burrow, obviously Chase. Are there any others that you look at? Hendrickson? I mean, are there, when you go down the line, are there maybe any surprises in there? Do you feel like that's kind of it?
Hendrickson's definitely in that bracket, I think. Now, edge rusher, I think, is tough because there's a ton of those elite guys in the NFL right now. Like, we've got half a dozen guys that are like legitimate defensive player of the year candidates in any given season. So it's a tougher field than it is for other positions. But I think Hendrickson definitely should be seen in that top 10 bracket, even if there's 15 guys that are top 10 quality, if you understand me.
Yeah. So it's definitely those 3, right? Burrow, Chase, Hendrickson, I would say. But I would say if you look at T. Higgins as a wide receiver 2, is he the best wide receiver 2 in the NFL, right? He's up there, one of the best wide receiver 2. So that position that he's filling, Mike Hilton as a nickel, he's top 5, right, as a nickel. So if you start to get granular with the positions, I do think you're looking at maybe 4 or 5 players that are the best at what they're expected to do.
And they've got a couple of other guys that are capable of that kind of season, right? Like the volatility we talked about. I mean, Geno Stone has just come off a season where he was clearly a top 10 safety. Whether or not he'll back that up again is up for debate, but he's obviously got that kind of year in him because we just saw one.
Do you see him as a system guy from Baltimore?
I see him as a guy who screams like high end of variance. Like the season that he's just come off reminds me a little bit of the year that Jarius Byrd had for this the Buffalo Bills years ago, right? They got him paid by and it was like, okay, he made a lot of plays, but there were also a lot of passes that were just sort of floated in the general direction of his coverage, and he picked them off. And like sometimes those all break in your direction in one year, and it just kind of screams regression the next year. It's like, that's not sustainable. That's not a thing that happens year after year after year. So, Geno Stone is coming off a career year. He was excellent. However, I don't think that kind of year happens again for him. And the question is, if you take away those plays, or at least a big portion of them, now what does the season look like?
I mean, the bigger thing at the safety position, though, and Paul, you might know this better than we do, is, how bad was communication there? How hamstrung did the Bengals feel from a flexibility standpoint defensively? I keep coming back to that. They very specifically targeted Geno Stone and an aging Von Bell to be back there over their youth, right? Over Jordan Battle, over Dax Hill. So if nothing else, even if Geno Stone has no interceptions, a safety sometimes just has to line up the defense, make sure that there's no busted coverages, don't be out of position. And if Geno Stone brings that to the table, I think it's just a massive impact compared to where they were last year.
Yeah, I think they realized last year that they've massively undervalued that and overestimated the ability of young players to quickly get to an average level compared to what they saw of an elite level of what Jesse Bates and Von Bell had in terms of communication. And it affected everyone. I mean, everyone talked about that as the year went along. Even Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt, who had down years, a lot of that was not having the communication behind them to make them feel confident in what they were doing. And the same with Mike Hilton, mentioned that, who struggled early. And then once that settled down a little bit, he played better. All right, let's talk AFC North. You can look at the view. I look at this the same way we have it last year. Bloodbath. Like, who knows, right? I mean, I think you could easily flip the coin, and whoever it lands on. Or I don't. How do you view the North? Do you see anybody massively above the rest, or is it going to be a matter of who gets the breaks?
Yeah, I mean, all 4 of those teams could be playoff teams, like conceivably. They're very different. They're composed in sort of different ways. Obviously, the Bengals have the elite quarterback. Baltimore has Lamar Jackson. The Browns might have the best roster top to bottom, but their quarterback is a question mark, despite with the irony of that contract being given to Deshaun Watson. And then Pittsburgh have quarterbacks for pennies on the dollar. But either one of them should have upgraded what they had last year in Kenny Pickett. So yeah, I think you're right. It's going to be injuries. It's going to be how the interdivision games go, how the games between them break. And it's probably the toughest division of football again.
Yeah, I completely agree. Tough division. I mean, the Ravens won it last year. They were the best regular season team in football. I think the Bengals are right there with the Ravens. But if Sam, you're talking about this uncomfortable offseason for the Bengals, it's even less comfortable in Baltimore, right? Derrick Henry's a big name coming in, but turnover on the offensive line, coaching staff that got depleted, including Mike McDonald at defensive coordinator. And so there might be some growing pains on that side of the ball for Baltimore. They're not as deep as they were last year. Lamar Jackson, MVP season and everything, he's great. And when he's healthy, they win a lot of games. But they've maybe gotten a little bit worse compared to last year. I think the big wild card, though, is Deshaun Watson, because if he just all of a sudden starts to play football well, the Browns might have the best roster in the division for non-quarterbacks as far as depth goes. So if he figures it out, maybe the Browns end up becoming even better than we expected.
Are we giving Russ Wilson a chance? Are we thinking that could work?
I mean,
better, but not good enough.
Yeah. Like I do think it has a incredibly broad range of outcomes. Like it's not just Russ, it's Russ within an Arthur Smith offense, which is itself, a very unusual sort of offense relative to the rest of the league. And you can you can paint a picture where you say that's actually the best system for Russell Wilson right now. It's not going to be the most pass-happy offense out there. It's going to use a ton of play action. These are all things that should stand to Russell Wilson. On the other hand, you can look at it in the negative side and you say, yeah, but Arthur Smith's offense likes targeting the middle of the field to the exclusion of everything else. And Russell Wilson has never done that well, even when he was playing at an elite level in Seattle. And so it's just not going to work at all. So I do think there's a chance you get the best version of Russell Wilson for the last couple of years out of this system. But I also think there's a chance that they reach like week 6 and decide this isn't working at all. Time to send for Justin Fields.
What is the status of the buffet with Mims and Orlando Brown and Trent Brown? Is it happening? And where is it happening? What's going on with it?
We do need it to happen.
Yeah, we need it to happen. Are they away on break? I mean, I feel like we may have missed our window here.
Orlando's around, but I don't. The rest of them, you're gonna have a hard time getting.
We do want to track them down. I'm also trying not to get to 300 pounds. This would put me over the top, I believe, because I'm a buffet away, I think.
Yeah.
But I would love to go head to head in a buffet with those offensive tackles. Would say I'm just sitting there chuckling as I'm downing filet and lamb chops nonstop here.
You're certainly that type of buffet away from 300.
That type of buffet, yeah.
I got on the scales for the first time in years the other day, and I'm 180. So I'm the perfect baseline for this, right? 180-pound normal human, and then these Goliaths all just hammering a Fogo buffet and see who can take down the most food.
You are generic 1 on Madden, whereas we're all just a bunch of Madden creative players, Sam. That's what it is. By the way, I can't believe I've gone the whole show really quick, Paul, without mentioning Jermaine Burton, my favorite draft pick in the entire draft. Jermaine Burton, I think he was the 4th best receiver in the draft. Unbelievable, blown away by his tape, and he can be the most important draft pick in this draft class for any team if he's as good as I think he is and other people around the league think he is. But they just have to figure out, keeping him in line because he could be a special player to go with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins.
There is no question. What was it about his tape that stood out most to you? I mean, we've talked a lot about Burton here without question, but I'll let you chime in with why was he your favorite? What was it about that tape?
I saw easy explosiveness, him getting behind defenses, and then saw ball skills and body control. That just looked like a first-round player. So you throw him a back shoulder, he adjusts to it perfectly. Didn't drop more than 2 passes, I don't think, his entire college career. So he's got good hands, body control, speed, second-level burst. The only question for me for Burton is like the short area stuff, right? Is he going to run a ton of, quick ins and outs and slants? I don't know if he's great at that. Wasn't asked to do that at Georgia or Alabama. But if you're talking pure vertical threat that could get behind the defense, catch the ball effectively, and beat man coverage, Jermaine Burton can do all of that. So he looked special to me on film.
You are preaching to the Bengals fan choir who have been excited about, well, really, and I wrote about this earlier in the year. People have asked a lot about, well, what's going to be the stamp of Dan Pitcher and how is that going to change things here? Is it going to be different? It's not going to be vastly different, but the focus on explosiveness, which they really have gotten away from in recent years and trying to create these 12-play, 80-yard drives over and over and over again, has been notable in every single move they've done, whether we're talking about Gesicki, who maybe they'll finally actually throw to a tight end in the intermediate over the middle, and you're talking about Burton, who they valued much higher than most teams, obviously, and were willing to take that chance, or a number of the things that they've done offensively, the move from Mixon to Brown and Moss, like a lot of the stuff that you've seen them do. And I think all of this is adding up to a different usage for Jamar Chase in a much more versatile, explosive package for him is, I think, been the theme of Dan Pitcher taking over. And so I'm curious to see where Burton ends up in the middle of that. And I know they are too. And you could be proven very right. Again, Steve, it could be another time where you end up looking prophetic for what happens with the Cincinnati team that you're so optimistic for. Bengals fans, I'm sure, are appreciating your view. And Sam, you might get some emails, but that's totally okay. That's totally okay because you could be proven right in the same way. You guys, I really appreciate you spending time with me. It was fantastic to have you on, and I hope everybody is checking out the PFF NFL podcast. It is a must listen for anybody that wants to know the NFL better. So thanks, guys. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll talk to you soon. We'll see you around.
No problem.
Thanks, Paul.